we're back on the Revolutionary Radio Project. I am your host, Rob Skiba, and I'm talking with my guest, Zen Garcia. We're going through the Book of Genesis, talking about the days of creation. We've camped out on day 4 because the scriptures that we dealt with in last week's show, actually on his broadcast on TFR, we were talking about the creation of the sun, moon, and stars and how they are there for signs and for seasons, times, days, years, and all that kind of stuff. And right before the break, we were discussing when does a day begin? And the whole issue of the sons of light versus the sons of darkness. This was a big issue in the Qumran community, people who wrote the Dead Sea Scrolls. That was a big deal. And you see other interesting scriptures. I'll put a few up on the screen in the New Testament in this regard. Whoops, let me switch that here. Stand by. All right. There's the mention in John 12:36, while ye have light, believe in the light, that ye may be the children of light. These things spake Jesus and departed and did hide himself from them. Paul says in Ephesians 5:8, for ye were sometimes darkness, but now are ye light in the Lord. Walk as children of light. 1 Thessalonians 5:5, but ye are all the children of light and the children of the day. We are not of the night nor of darkness. And the context in that, the last one there is, people always say, he's going to come like a thief in the night. Talking about the rapture, nobody's going to know. Well, that's like the previous verses. And he says, but you children are not in darkness. He should come like a thief in the night. Like everybody wants to skip that part right there. Right. Now, I can see where people would say, perhaps I'm taking these out of context. I don't know. I mean, when you consider, especially what was going on in the Dead Sea Scrolls and how that was an issue, it may be that these are more literal than just figures of speech. I understand that Jesus is the light and we should walk in the light of Jesus and stuff like that. That's where a lot of people would take this. But, and I believe that's certainly true. But there may be more to it than that. And there is another guy on my Facebook page. He was commenting on a graphic that I put up showing, if you assume the day begins at sunrise versus if you believe the day starts at sunset. His name is Jeff George, and he said in commenting on this, he said that it acts like a sine wave if you plot this out. And he created a graphic showing, starting at sunrise, the wave goes up to noon, and then the wave goes down to sunset across the horizontal line and dips down to the bottom midnight, which would be the opposite of noon, and then comes back up like a sine wave. And that's for a day. And then for the months, if you start the year at the vernal equinox, 3/21, March 21st, that's when your year begins. It goes up to the summer solstice, 6/21, comes down to the autumnal equinox, 9/21, dips down to the winter solstice, and then heads back up again. So this is another issue on the calendar, is when does the year begin? So we talk about when does the day begin? When does the year begin? And you have secular Jews celebrating what they call Rosh Hashanah, which was just like, a week ago, 10 days ago. Tishri 1, Feast of Trumpets, Yom Teruah, is also to the Jews, secular Jews, I would say, is known as Rosh Hashanah, which means head of the year. So they're saying that's the head of the year in the fall. But Scripture doesn't say that. Scripture says that your year begins in the spring. It's the month that Passover's in. And it just makes sense. That's when life begins to grow again, all over the world, So, I think it's important that we discuss these things and get your take on it as well.
Absolutely. And I'm in full agreement with you. That's why our Enochian seasonal lunar solar calendar began this year, because I believe that we had the Adar too. And it began in April. And it runs through March, and in other years it runs from March to February, which is again in the solar. The year begins with vernal equinox because that's the beginning of spring. The equinoxes and the solstices actually divide the seasons, and Enoch describes this in the first portion of the book on the courses of the heavenly luminaries, talking about the movement of the sun between the Tropic of Capricorn and the Tropic of Cancer. And he begins his discussion when it's between the third and fourth gate, which is on the equinox, for the vernal equinox. And that, again, is the beginning of spring. Then he describes 91 days as it's moving northward. And then when it reaches the Tropic of Cancer, it reverses course and begins to head south. And on the summer solstice is the beginning of summer. Then for 91 days, it moves back towards the equator, reaching the equator 12 hours a day, 12 hours a night. That begins fall on the autumnal equinox, and then it moves 91 days towards southern latitudes, and that becomes our fall and winter. And then it reaches the Tropic of Capricorn for the winter solstice, our shortest day, and reverses course and begins to move back towards the equator, and that begins winter in the 3 months leading to what will again be spring. And so I absolutely believe that God's calendar is linear, begins with spring, and then moves through the seasons, unlike the Gregorian pagan calendar, which begins in the middle of winter in January.
Mm-hmm. So if I understand what you just said, you believe in the idea of the 13th month being added. And so sometimes for you, spring doesn't begin in March 21st, it begins in April.
Right. And that's all because of intercalation. And that has to do with not only the barley harvest, because the barley harvest has to be ripe for the waving of the barley sheaf on the day of first fruits by the high priest as a sin offering for Israel, but also that because the calendar that we set up is based on both the movements of the sun and the moon. And as I describe it in my Flat Earth as Key to Decrypt the Book of Enoch, Enoch describes a 364-day solar year, which creates the seasons based on the equinoxes and the solstices. And then the 354-day lunar year is what determines the Sabbaths and the Levitical feast days. Like, for instance, the 15th of Nisan is always a full moon, as is the 15th of Tishri, which are the Feast of Unleavened Bread and also Tabernacles. And the only way that can stay in alignment is if you set and are using for Sabbath and the feast days a lunar calendar based on the cycles and the phases of the moon, which is what I sent you and how we plotted that our Sabbaths fall on after the appearance of the waxing crescent, which is the new moon, Kadesh, then every 7 days according to the quarterly phases of the moon, the first quarter full, third quarter and lunar conjunctive moon, that sets the appointment for Sabbath. And in my opinion, God established the moon and the way that it works according to these cycles for a heavenly witness as to when Sabbath should be determined. And so most people think that we only follow the movements of the moon, which is incorrect. We follow both the solar and the lunar calendar and then intercalate them, which, because there's a 354-day lunar calendar, 364-day solar calendar, there's a metatonic cycle that means 7 out of every 19 years, because the synodic month averages 29.531 days. It's not perfectly exact, and sometimes you'll have two 30-day months back to back. And so it skews it so that that 13th month sometimes will appear after 2 years, sometimes after 3 years, and the metatonic cycle is what determines that. And people that know and have studied the way that the calendars are intercalated and come together, that this is the reason why, so that when the year, the new moon begins before the vernal equinox, then often you will have to have that 13th month added in order for the barley harvest to be correct in alignment for the day of first fruits. And this year, the vernal equinox was actually the full moon as far as where Passover was. And so, only one day into spring, the barley, in my opinion, was not ready. And so you have to add the 13th month, Adar 2, which we did to this year in order for the barley harvest to be ready for the celebration of the Passover festivals and the barley sheaf being waved on the 16th of Nisan.
Okay, so I'm just going to say on the outset here that I'm an open book on this right now. My home group, my home Bible study group, had put together a calendar that for the longest time I was in full agreement with. Initially, our group was a conjunction group. We believed that the month started with a conjunction. Then we moved to Crescent after a guy who's literally obsessively studied this topic, singular topic, for like 20-something years, has written extensively on it, came to our home group and sat there and had to deal with me for 3 hours throwing, well, yeah, but what about? Yeah, but what about? What about? Yeah, but what about? And he fielded every question I had, knocked them out of the park with scripture. And that's what I look for. It's like, look, if you can counter all my arguments with scripture and prove that I'm wrong, great, I'll switch. I don't care. I want to know what the truth is.
Right, absolutely.
I have in my mind what scripture is telling me, but from everything from pre-trib rapture to biblical cosmology and now the calendar, I've been proven wrong. So from what I previously believed, and trust me, back then I was just as dogmatic about the things that I now believe as I am now. And
right.
The me of 10 years ago and the me of today would fight nonstop till both of us passed out, from exhaustion, and neither one of us would have won the debate. So, I'm at the point now as crossed over the half century mark, that I'm thinking, the more I learn, the less I think I know.
Right. Absolutely. I'm with you there.
So I'm listening to you. I'm hearing what you're saying. I'm not saying I agree yet. Right now, I'm going to put some things up on the screen here, just sort of share my perspective on this. For those who are watching on YouTube, those who are listening on the radio, you can go to virtualhousechurch.com, and on the main menu, scroll down to on the left side, you'll see a calendar. You can click on that calendar, and this calendar was put together by my home Bible study group that I used to be a part of. I still love all those people dearly. Consider them to be really good friends and family. But what happened with me is a lot of times new people are starting to come into the group, and, God help me, but I'm always questioning stuff, and I don't want to be a stumbling block, and when you bring up some of these topics, as even as fired up in the chat room, some people are getting probably already, right. People don't like, they're resistant to change.
Yes, and they are. Oh my gosh.
They will fight it. And, I just felt like when I started wrestling with the issue, when does the day begin? And I just brought it up. It kind of floated the idea in the group. And of course, a bee's nest started stirring up, I'm like, okay, well, Sabbath is supposed to be a day of rest, and this is not restful for me. So, and it may be causing strife, that could be a stumbling block for new people that are just coming in. And, I'm not a milkshake kind of guy. I'm more like, give me a substantial meal here.
Absolutely.
So I kind of need to be plugged in when it comes to Bible study with people like yourself, people that are well-read, that can dive deep and are not afraid to share even opposing ideas and bounce on as iron sharpens iron. And so, right now we're kind of without a home group. This is sort of like our weekly Bible study right now, what we're doing here, because I know even in the past, even in disagreement, we can continue as brothers, and it's all going to be good. And hopefully people can learn from our exchange. But this group right here that put together our calendar believes that the day begins at sunset. And there's a lot of good stuff in here. In the introduction to the calendar, they describe, sort of where we came to the conclusions, how we came to the conclusions, and what they believe going into it. And then they've got the calendar marked off with the day beginning at sunset and a weekly Sabbath on Saturday. So where I differ on this is now I am leaning more towards the idea that the day begins at sunrise than sunset. So some things shift for me, but not a whole. for the most part, not a whole lot changes. Now, what's interesting to me is you're on the Enochian calendar, and that the Day of Atonement still ended up for you on the same day as it ended up for us, this calendar. And the only reason I'm still following this calendar right now is because I'm uncertain, okay, about a lot of these things. This calendar, I at least understand. I understand. I understand.
Important.
Yeah, I understand this calendar, so I can walk in it, but I'm not like married to it that this
Right.
has to be correct. I don't yet know enough about some of the other models that are out there, like yours and others, that I'm comfortable just jumping ship and going the other direction, because I need to understand it
Yes.
to do
Important.
it. Now, there's another guy who spoke at the Take on the World conference. His name is Zach. Boy, I don't want to butcher his last name here. Struheric, I think. I'm sorry, brother, if I butchered your last name. But he and another guy, Micah Kissling, did a presentation on biblical feasts and the Zadok priestly calendar at the Take on the World conference. And if people are interested, they could go to Take on the World TV, the YouTube channel Take on the World TV, and look it up. It was published on August 23rd, 2019, and watch his presentation. Now, from what I'm gathering, looking at your calendar, Zen, and looking at their calendar, he sent me a PDF of his calendar. Now, I got your calendar up on the screen right now as a PDF that you sent me. And he sent me, let's see if I have it here. He sent me his calendar. And the big difference that I see between his and yours is that while it seems like you guys are following sort of the same trajectory and line of reasoning, they still maintain a weekly Shabbat on Saturday, where your Shabbat floats because you are, correct me if I'm wrong, believing in what they call a lunar Sabbath.
Yes, the waxing crescent establishes the first day of the lunar month, and then you have the quarterly phases aligned to the first full third quarter and lunar conjunctive moons, and that's when Sabbath is. And with regard to the Zadok priesthood calendar, that calendar is based on the 364-day solar calendar, and it's to determine which of the priests would serve during that particular month. And so you find this in the Dead Sea Scrolls, but it's not for, in my opinion, determining the Sabbath or the Levitical feast days, but it's more for determining, again, which priest would serve for that particular month of the solar yearly cycle. And that's what the Zadok priestly calendar is specifically in reference to, and has everything to do with determining that cycle, not the Sabbath or the Levitical feast days, in my opinion.
Okay, so one of the things I like about this calendar, the Zadok calendar, is the issue of the Shabbat still being on Saturday. And I'll kind of share my issues with the lunar Sabbath, because I went down that path also. There was a video that I saw by World's Last Chance, I think is the YouTube channel, that was trying to make a really compelling case for it. And I will say they made a fairly compelling argument. But then I started looking into it for myself, and I'll just share a few things here on the screen for people that are watching on YouTube. And I wrote a blog about this on my Ephraim Awakening website. People could go to EphraimAwakening.com if they want to check it out, and just do a search for lunar or weekly Sabbath. And here's what I wrote here. I said, when is the Sabbath? I know this is a debate currently raging in some circles. Is the Sabbath based on the moon, or has it always been about the consistent seventh day of the week? Well, consider the fact that Saturday is Shabbat in Hebrew, Savato in Greek, and then I went through and listed numerous other nations, many nations, for as long as they have history, would point to the day that we now call the Saturday, the day that we call Saturday on our calendar. They refer to it as a derivative of either the Hebrew word Shabbat or the Greek word Sabbaton or Sabbato. And so, multiple cultures are calling the day we call Saturday by that name. There are plenty of other reasons to accept that the Sabbath is and always was on the day we now call Saturday, but I can't help but think all these nations didn't just coincidentally use a word for the seventh day that just so happens to sound like and or derive from Shabbat, Sabbaton, or Sabbath. Seems to me this may also answer the questions of the lunar Sabbath idea. Are all these nations wrong? I don't think so. I know plenty of people will disagree with the above, but after studying the lunar Sabbath model, the history of multiple cultures just don't seem to support it. The Passion Week seems to become either quite awkward or completely falls apart too, in some cases, like when the conjunction lasts 2 days. You also end up with either an 8-day work weeks, which I saw on your calendar, Zen, some 8-day work weeks, and or double back-to-back Sabbaths, which would mean you work for 6 days, then rest for 1, but the following week work for 5 days and rest for 2 days, yet with the exception of Moedim, appointed times, wherein you have a high Sabbath, a Sabbath rest apart from the weekly Sabbath, we have no such commandment to work less or more than 6 days. Plus, the count of 7 days started at creation with day 1, period. But if you go off the moon, your count would have to start on day 4. Moses repeatedly states that the Sabbath is in recognition of creation and how Yahuwah rested on the 7th day, not day 11, 7 days after the moon showed up. And the argument concerning the name of the 7th day is a red herring. People want to say that, Saturday, blah, 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 deals with Saturn. The Hebrews didn't have names for the days. They were numbered. The names other nations gave the days have changed over time, and now we call the 7th day Saturday. But to suggest that we are honoring/worshiping Saturn is nonsense. If you go that route, then the lunar Sabbath folks are worshiping Luna, the Roman moon goddess. But that's just a really stupid argument, if you ask me. Overall, I finally came to the conclusion that the lunar Sabbath idea just doesn't work. So needless to say, I'm more than convinced that the 7th day is and always was on the day we call Saturday. And sorry, but excuse me, hang on. Sorry, I had to clear my throat. Constantine had no authority to change it to Sunday, and that's a whole other issue. But then I found a video that I found to be really interesting by a guy that studies nature, and he particularly has a thing for studying the behavioral patterns of beavers. And he saw that beavers and actually quite a number of other animals stop working on the day that we call Saturday.
That's interesting.
Say, busy beavers, because, like ants, beavers are really busy creatures and they're always, constructing things. And they actually physically stop working on the day that we call Sabbath. And he pointed out actually some variety of bees do and several others as well. So these were just some of the reasons why I ended up ultimately rejecting the lunar Sabbath idea. But when I looked at your calendar, even today, like going to April, you have your lunar conjunctive Sabbath on April 4th, a Thursday, and then you count the 5th, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 days before your next Sabbath. So you'd have an 8-day work week before a 9th day Sabbath. And I found the same thing in March and several other times where you don't have a 6-day work week and a 7th day of rest. You have anywhere from 7 days of work to 8 days of work, and even some cases 2 days of work. So kind of curious how you get around that issue.
Yeah, again, in my opinion, Sabbath is established with the cycles of the moon. And then as far as Kadesh and Translation Day, Kadesh is called a new moon convocation. So it's celebrated, but not like a Sabbath. There aren't the strict restrictions as you have for Sabbath. And then, you do have the translation days, which do add a day, at the end of the calendar, usually every other month. But those days are not included in the 7-day count of what are the working days leading up to Sabbath. Both the Kadesh and translation days are excluded from that 7-day count. And again, I'll bring up 2 stories that we were talking about previously, even in the last show we did. In the 7-day count, bringing up the story of the Joshua's march on Jericho, you have this 7 days leading up to the march and the conquest of Jericho. And if you have Sabbath every 7 days, then God would be breaking his commandment to honor the Sabbath in directing them to do this 7-day march, unless they were following, in my opinion, a calendar, a lunar, a lunar Sabbath calendar as we have it, and as I shared it with you. And you actually get confirmation of this in the book of Jasher, because it tells you that the beginning of their march in Jasher chapter 88, verse 14 through 17, it says, "And it was in the second month on the first day of the month, which is Kadesh." And again, remember, Kadesh is not included in the 7-day count of the working days. And so you have this day, including the 6 working days that make the 7 days for the 7-day marches around Jericho. And it says, "And it was in the second month on the first day of the month that Yahweh sent," well, we'll pick it up on